And thank you, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, it's very interesting. The Buddhism in the modern world, you know. I mean, one of the interesting things about Tibet was that, you know, they were isolated, which meant that when, you know, these Tibetans, when they came out in 1959, 1960, they talked, you could say that they talked in exactly the same way as they talked 1,000 years before, because what the benefit of being isolated was that there's this extraordinary kind of tradition coming from India, you know, carried in the minds of, you know, Padmasambhava and the other yogis and scholars, and from the great Nalanda tradition, as the Dalai Lama always likes to point out, we are the Nalanda tradition. So this incredible body of knowledge studied for hundreds of years, as we know, in this amazing place near Rajgir, near Vulture Peak, this incredible place of study and learning, you know. I remember one time there, when we go on pilgrimages, we go to these ruins, you know, and I think it started around the 5th, 6th century, flourished then 7th, 8th, 9th, and then died out. And that, of course, coincided, not being sectarian, with the influx of Islam, is what happened. And he said when they burned he said the library took 6 months to burn. He talked like that. The place apparently is astonishingly big. It was just because Buddhism was flourishing, all aspects of Buddhism, totally centralized in this extraordinary place. So I think this body of knowledge is so remarkable, and I think it's good to remember where it came from. And these extraordinary so-called Hindus, I mean, I don't know all the names of the different traditions there, but I remember the Dalai Lama often says it was more than 3,000 years ago that these Indians, these amazing Indians, well before the Buddha, they were the ones who began the investigation into the nature of self. So I think even we Buddhists, you know, who like, I mean, we Westerners who like Buddhism, I mean, I think it's even now we're only really seeing the incredible body of knowledge that's been existing these thousands of years, you know. So nourished in Nalanda, all aspects of all the Buddhist views and ideas, and then carried in the minds of these great yogis and scholars and holy beings in the 7th century to Tibet, where it was kept intact because they were so isolated, you know. So I know when I first heard the teachings, it was in Chenrezig Institute, I think it was 76 in Australia, I think one of the first Tibetan Buddhist centers, Lama Zopa. It was one of the, like their second course, I think. And I mean, my own background was interesting because I'd been brought up a Catholic in Melbourne, and then, you know, about 19 or 20 in mid-60s decided I'd prefer God, you know, give up God and hello boys. And so I never had guilt. I thought guilt was a boring idea. So I just pursued my own views and became this kind of raging hippie, and then went to London in the 60s and then kind of revolutionary and radical left politics, and then black politics, and then finally feminist politics. And so it was this kind of internal evolution for me, looking for a way to see the world. And by the time I'd then a feminist, radical lesbian feminist, and then by the mid-70s, really wanting a spiritual path again, you know. So then I bumped into these lamas. I went to this course at Chenrezig Institute. I'd been doing martial arts, which I thought was my path, and then some kind fellow ran over my foot, stopping my karate career. Then I bumped into Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, right? And I know it was a shock in many ways, especially politically, because there I was female. And suddenly this ancient Indian patriarchal way of presenting was quite shocking to me, but I knew there was something there that I had to pursue, you know. But what was so powerful was that the first month of the course, Lama Zopa teaching, I heard the English words he was saying. He's kindly learned English, but I really didn't understand the concepts, because they were literally, he was talking like they would have talked in the 7th century, 8th century, 10th century. And I mean, we have to realize that it was so profoundly a way of different, the use of words, the concepts, the structures, everything was so utterly old, which doesn't mean it's not valid. So, of course, the tendency is to want to chuck the baby out of the bathwater and make it modern, but that we've got to be very cautious about that, because this is what I'm learning. I realized then, you know, that I had to listen carefully. I mean, if this is a valid body of knowledge, if this is valid stuff I'm listening to, I can't just chuck it out and do what you like. It's so rude, it's arrogant. You've got to learn it first, internalize it, and then it's our job to present it in our culture in ways that are reasonable, not just mouth 14th century concepts, you know. So there's a danger we can throw the baby out of the bathwater, and that's arrogant. But I think I really had a feeling it was kind of, we were at that point, we are still at that point, if it's only 50 years, 60 years of this transition, you know, and if it's going to be stable in the minds of new people, so-called Western people, it's got to come from experience. It can't just be words, you know, you can't just make up a new Buddhism. You've got to really treat it with respect. And my feeling is often in the West, we treat religion with no respect at all, because we believe religion is just something you believe, you make it up, you can think what you like, because we don't trust religion, you know. I mean, that's certainly the philosophical materialist view. But I mean, if we look at the Buddhist view and the Buddhist world of knowledge, and so I think it is now with more and more of these talks, you know, the Dalai Lama has been at the forefront of these amazing discussions with the best brains of the West, you know, and it's really now with a bit of the kind of Westerners are a little bit humbled. I mean, like I said, His Holiness said it was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago who began the investigation into the nature of self. We probably thought it was Freud 100 years ago, you know, we smarty pants, you know. So, I mean, I think Westerners are learning this now, and scientists especially, and the best thinkers in our world are really learning about this extraordinary model of this way of seeing the world, you know. So, of course, it's all very nice to be intellectual and be theoretical and philosophical, and it is amazing. But what's the essence of the Buddhist one? And that's what I think is important. When I first heard these teachings from Lama Zopa, I couldn't get the point. I couldn't find the essence, you know. I couldn't hear what is this about, you know. So slowly, of course, I became dedicated. I took refuge. I went to Kathmandu a year later, became a nun, and here I am 46 years later or something, 45, whatever it is, and it's my path, and I'm sincere about it, try to be sincere, but try to understand it. I mean, I've done some intensive study, but not much. But the essence of it, as I keep moving with this path, all the time trying to internalize it and be sincere and try to find the essence of it. The essence of it is the human mind. The essence of it is the mind. That's Buddha's expertise. I would say that. You know, he doesn't talk, as we know very well, if we're Buddhists, he doesn't talk about a separate component in us, which is mystical, that comes from a creator or a soul. Buddha talks about a mind. And this is a really powerful point, you know, because as soon as we hear religion, we mystify it. So, but Buddha's talking about the mind, and that we don't mystify. But of course, his view of the mind is radically different. He doesn't say it's the brain. He says it does not come from your parents. It does not come from a creator. It's your own. He talks about a continuity of consciousness that goes from this life to a future one. It's not just some hippie, trippy idea. It's dealt with in great depth in the literature. It's a serious view, you know, this view of the mind. And I mean, it was, like I said, it was these Indians. They're the ones who investigated and created this technique that we all know vaguely, we all know is single point of concentration, shamatha, calm abiding. This incredibly sophisticated psychological skill, not kidding, you know, that enables a person, which is what these Indians did, and then Buddha took this technique with him when he diverged in his own direction. It enables you to completely subdue the grosser level of our consciousness, our conceptuality, and our sensory. And as we know, that's all we posit as existing in the modern world in neuroscience. So I mean, what Buddha's positing is pretty radical in these much subtler levels of mind, which in the long term, if we really want to achieve this, these things that Buddha would say everyone has the potential to achieve, that is to say, to remove utterly from our mind all the misconceptions, all the voices of ego that cause us so much suffering and cause us to harm others, anger, attachment, jealousy, low self-esteem, attachment, we know these words. The Buddha's view is that these are not integral to us. These are not at the core of our being. And this is his simple, profound finding, you know. This is the essence of being a Buddhist. Learn to identify, and then through these more subtle methods to drill down ever more deep, and identify and unpack and unravel and eventually deconstruct and remove altogether from the mind these misconceptions that we've had for eons, Buddha says, that literally are misconceptions about the universe, about the self. This is how he talks. So, I mean, the way, if you put it in really kind of modern words, it's a very exciting concept, not just repeat, you know, 7th century Indian words. It's a very powerful idea. But he's saying not only can we remove all the misconceptions and the nonsense from the mind, which is not at the core of our being, and which is the source of our pain and suffering, and the source of why we therefore harm others. Not only can we do that, but we have these other parts of our mind that are at the core of our being, that do define us, that are who we really are, and they're called love and compassion and kindness and generosity and intelligence and forgiveness. Nothing cosmic about it. This is the essence of being a Buddhist. Whatever we do, if we say it's being a Buddhist, whether we do prostrations, whether we wear these 14th century Tibetan robes, or I shave my head, or I do all these so-called rituals, all which should have meaning if we're going to do them, all of the purpose of all of these have to be for this one job of lessening your neuroses and your ridiculous rubbish, which is the cause of suffering, and growing all your positive qualities, which are the cause of your happiness. This is the essence of it. So we can get that. Once we get the essence of it, then all the rest, we can understand where it's coming from. Otherwise it can be very confusing. What is Buddhism? What does it mean? And especially Tibetans. I mean, look at the Tibetan monasteries. You can't believe yourself. You can't believe what's going on. What is all this about? What is the essence of all this? And I think that's why it's so important to really unpack it all and be very reasonable about it, not just make up our own trip and think, oh yeah, this is Buddhism and I don't want that, like go around supermarket shopping. We've got to sort of see the background of this extraordinary views and these extraordinary techniques to basically help sentient beings become less neurotic, less miserable, and more kind and more happy and more wise. I mean, how marvelous, that's the essence of it. And I think, yeah, that's the essence of it. For me, that's what I try to convey when I try to, do the job I've got. Lama Zopa asked me to start teaching, and back in '87, when I was in New Zealand, he said I should go and teach. I've been doing that, trying my best. But of course, that means I have to keep studying and practicing myself, otherwise I'm a complete phony. So that's really the essence of it, And of course, this is the hardest job we'll ever do. And this is because, another way of putting it all is that, putting it more directly, again, more precisely, more directly, and this is simply quoted, this is coming straight from the Four Noble Truths, Buddha's first teaching. He basically, the Four Noble Truths, first, or the Four Truths for the noble ones. I don't think the truths are noble. That's just the way they call it. A noble one is a person who's achieved the realizations of this. Well, the first one is there is suffering, and he's got 3 levels. The first kind is the suffering of suffering, and that's the stuff we all know about. That's when the bad things happen. That we know we don't like, and that is the only suffering we understand. Then he's got these more nuanced views, more subtle views of suffering at subtler levels, the suffering of change and all pervasive suffering. Forget that one even. Forget those. But even just his first one, so then the second one is, well, you know what, people, there are causes of this suffering. And it's very straightforward. As far as Buddha is concerned, there are 2 main causes. I mean, this is where you can listen to, and he presents his views about cause and effect, which again are extensive in the Buddhist philosophy. And a cause and effect we all know about as Westerners, that's called science. You know very well, if you have to grow a flower, you can't just, you've got to be precise. What are the causes of a flower? You gather those causes together and you'll get a flower. And once you learn it, it's going to be coherent and it'll work every time. It's logic. That's called science. That's Buddha's approach, surprisingly to us, so the cause, he's talking about the cause of suffering now. So we identify, you're suffering, you've got a headache or something, it's called suffering, simple example. And he says, well, and obviously, if you have a problem and you want to find the solution, you first have to identify the problem very clearly. This is in ordinary life. Then you have to identify the causes. Otherwise, how can you find the solution? Well, that's exactly what the Four Noble Truths are. But we can't hear it. It's too intense. Because what he's telling us is, well, guess what, Robina? That's called suffering, So there are causes. And Robina, there are many causes, but the main causes are both inside you. Now, that's the part we don't like hearing. This is too much for our minds. It's too shocking for us. We can't hear it because with our neurotic, guilty self-hate, we just take it as a weapon to beat ourselves up because it's called, the first cause of suffering is called karma, which is the term in Sanskrit that really summarizes his law of cause and effect. And then the second one is called delusions, which is the neurotic parts of your mind. So you mean, and then our first impulse is, oh, you mean I'm the blame? So we don't want to hear it, So as we can see in the world, there's always, there's okay, why is it we can't find it so hard to hear this and take it on board and therefore apply the solution? The long-term solution, sure, take a pill, nothing wrong, but the long-term solution, so that you won't get headaches again, is, it's too hard for us to hear this because we don't hear it properly. I think we hear it through the lenses of our dualistic view of punishment and reward. And I'm not being critical. I mean, I was a very devoted Catholic. I'm very grateful for my Catholic upbringing. But the philosophical view there is really quite powerful. There is a being who is the creator of the universe, who's all-powerful, all-knowing. That's okay. Buddha says we can also become all-powerful and all-knowing. He calls that a Buddha, but he doesn't give the job of a creator. That is a view that's fundamentally different in Buddhism. We should get clear if we want to say we're Buddhists. It's quite a powerful point. It's not just an incidental point. It's a philosophical point about the very way things exist. For the Buddha, it's a misconception, you know. So he posits this powerful capacity for developing wisdom and compassion. He calls that Buddha. But our Christian views, our Muslim views, you know, our view that most major religious views posit a creator, a superior being who runs the show, who creates, who punishes, and who rewards. I'm not being sarcastic. That's, you know. So then if we have that view deeply in our being, and you don't blame your Catholic mother or your Jewish mother for that view, the Buddha would say this dualistic view that posits, you know, that is kind of like, that brings this view of guilt is misconception, you know. But we hear it like that. Oh, you mean I'm a bad person, we hear, you know. But so the view that we have got, he says, which is the samsaric view, basically we're samsarists. It's his view of the misconception of, as far as we're concerned, the samsaric view is the main cause of my suffering is the loud noise that caused my headache. The main cause of my happiness is the kind of girlfriend who gave me a gift. So our view, the samsaric view, as far as we are concerned, the main cause of suffering, and then indeed of happiness, is something out there. The main cause of Buddha is something in here. So so even to begin to hear this, even as a theory, it's pretty intense. But then to unpack that theory and learn to apply it, the view of karma, the view of the Buddha's incredible view of the mind, how it works. This is what being a Buddhist is. It's kind of making this paradigm shift in the mind where we learn everything when it happens. Because for the Buddha, the first cause of everything is your past karma. He's meaning this very sincerely, not just some hippie trippy thing. It's deeply described in all the literature, you know. It's not a question of liking it or not liking it. We have to understand it. If we're going to reject it or take it on board, either way, we better understand it, not just be emotional, you know. It's a powerful concept. And the way, for me, when I first heard the teachings about karma, I remember feeling that was what had been missing in my life. I found it was so powerful because the way I heard it, the way I hear it now, is it's an empowering idea. You know, I mean, the materialist view is that your mummy and daddy decide to have sex and you come out. So in a sense, they're the blame. In a sense, they are the blame for you. You should blame your parents. If you've got anger and depression, you should blame your parents. I'm not even being sarcastic because that's logical. If they created you, then of course they're the blame. Now, equally, if God created you, he has to be the blame. But you can't talk like that. You know, that would be too shocking, isn't it? Although some people blame God. I heard the Italians tell me they have the rudest words for God when things go wrong, you know, and they have the rudest word for Our Lady. She's a whore. God is a pig. I mean, I was a Catholic, and I mean, I nearly fainted when I heard all that, and we'd never say a word against God. So, but I mean, it's logical. If you've got a creator, they're the boss. You have to blame them, both for the happiness and the suffering. But we don't want to. But so the Buddha's view is, no, there's no such thing as blame. You are responsible. Everything you think, this is the essence of karma, is every millisecond of what we think and do and say, just naturally, is the process that produces me. So in that sense, as Dalai Lama sometimes says, karma is like self-creation. Now, who wouldn't like that idea? I love that idea because it means I'm in charge. I think it's empowering, as I've really tried to take on board in my practice, the teachings about karma, which is huge, is really difficult. The impulse is to point the fingers out. You don't take it as a guilty thing. You use it to empower yourself. You use it to realize that you can turn yourself into the person that you want to become. You are the boss. That's the productive way to hear it. But if we just repeat the medieval words and repeat the way the Tibetans talk, because the Tibetans sound very fundamentalist, we'll never be able to understand it, you know, because our way of hearing things is so different. So I find the view of karma incredible, so empowering, so amazing that our consciousness goes back and back. Everything we think and do and say programs us, and then it's up to us to do the programming. I am the one who's in charge of turning myself into exactly the person I want. I mean, you can't think of anything more empowering than that. That's the essence of karma. I love that idea, but it doesn't say it like that in the literature, you know, so we misunderstand it. So to hear the teachings, I know like I said, when I first heard, I really struggled to understand the concepts, but I knew there was something there, so I persevered, you know. So then over these years, because my job is editing, working with words and having to speak the words, and then trying to practice it myself, I've got to put my money where my mouth is, then all the time processing, finding new ways to say it, finding authentic ways to say it, not just making up, you know. This is what I find very powerful, because it's our job in this time of 50, 60 years, certainly since it's come from Tibet, which is my tradition. But I mean, we know Westerners have been investigating Buddhism for hundreds of years, but it's only really entrenching itself now in the modern culture, isn't it? So, yeah, that's the essence of it, what I want to say. So now I'll ask some questions.
Yeah, that's a good timing, because I wanted to ask you a question, because the
Good.
way I've heard the second noble truth explained is as craving.
As what time?
As craving.
As what?
Craving.
Craving is craving. Okay.
And so, but you're saying karma.
Yes. I'll understand. The two main, according to the Four Noble Truths, the way I've understood it and studied it, there are two main causes of suffering. One is the past karma that has programmed your mind, that has set us up to have this experience. But keep remembering it's also the same causes for happiness. Every time anything good happens, the same logic applies to happiness. So, you've done virtuous things, that it programs your mind, you manifest it, you come in the next life, you and I meet, and we are kind to each other, we give each other things. This is not just accidental, this is due to our past virtuous karma. We've been kind to each other. One is karma. The other one, which is the main one, and this is the point now, your word, craving. Another word for that is attachment, or delusions in general, but specifically, according to the Four Noble Truths, essentially, you're absolutely right. These two subsume to the delusions in general, but the main one effectively is attachment, is craving. Yes, it comes down to that one. Absolutely, I agree.
And the way I've heard it, it's deeper than just sort of day-to-day craving. It's a craving for existence.
Even to that degree. And I think, okay, shall we talk about attachment the way I understand it? Shall we do that?
Sure.
Craving, yeah. I think it's, of course, at the first level, like everything, it's taught simply, it's taught simply. Then as you progress yourself, as we internalize it, it gets, our view of it gets ever more deep, ever more deep. I remember Lama Yeshe saying, I could tell you about craving, attachment, desire. These words are synonymous. For one whole year, you'll never begin to understand it. And basically until you start internalizing it and developing a practice. And that's reasonable. You can talk about a cake theory for 27 years, but until you start making cakes, you won't really understand it. It's got to be internalized. So the way, attachment, all the delusions, the key thing is all these neurotic states of mind, the voices of ego, if you like. Okay, the background, go back a bit, Helen. If we study the Buddhist model of the mind, we're going to discover that he's very clear in presenting there's three categories of states of mind. We have millions of states of mind. We have 1,000 thoughts a second, but we can divide them into three categories. Those that are neurotic, delusional, affliction, the word they use, affliction, unhappy, and the source of our pain, and they're called attachment, anger, jealousy, low self-esteem, simple words, and all of the variations. Then you've got the positive qualities, compassion, love, and kindness. We all know these words without being psychologists, but this is the stuff of Buddhist psychology. But you've got this really clear analysis of the difference between these different states of mind. So the key characteristic of all the neurotic ones, the deluded ones, the afflictions, as they call them in Buddhist literature, is that they're deeply disturbing, and that's reasonable. Check the last time you were anxious or jealous or depressed. You don't say, oh, wow, Robina, I was jealous yesterday. It was just great. It's painful. This is the key first thing he wants us to see, the Buddha, in order to give it up. But the deeper one is once we start to really understand and study the Buddhist model of the mind, we're going to discover that these unhappy states of mind, at their root, they're rooted in being misconceptions. They misrepresent things to us. So we've got strong attachment at a simplest level, strong attachment, say, for a cake, simplest level. We know very well the cake that appears to us on that plate looks so divine, so delicious. But the person who hates chocolate cake, they're not going to see a delicious cake. They see something revolting. So it's so clear the cake that exists there is not the cake that I see or that you see. We make up our own projections. We make up our own stories. And this is the key thing in Buddhist psychology, the key function of all these neurotic states of mind. They extrapolate, they exaggerate, they decorate, they don't cause us to not be in touch with reality. This is the long-term view that Buddha has. So this attachment, it's multifaceted, Yes, and it's interesting. There's a book I edited of Lama Zopa's, How to Face Death Without Fear, which is really helpful information. And as he says, the greatest, the main cause of fear at the time of death is this primordial attachment to me, grasping at me, grasping, the most primordial grasping, the most primordial instinctive grasping arises so intensely, which is why death is so fearful for most of us. So more than for sex and drugs and rock and roll and anything. So you're absolutely right. It's totally kind of primordial, this instinctive attachment to me, to I. and this means to this body, as far as we're concerned, you know. But if we look at it, if we unpack it in daily life, we're going to see it's multifaceted. One of the most primordial levels of attachment, and the Buddha would say it's because of having practiced it in the past and bringing it with us, it brings the result of dissatisfaction. This is its energetic level, and we all recognize that. This primordial feeling that we're not enough, that we don't have enough, that I can't, whatever I've achieved, it's not enough. Whoever I am, it's not enough. However I look, it's not enough. There's this default assumption, and this is the energy of attachment, the result of practicing it from countless lifetimes, Buddha says, of just primordial, painful dissatisfaction. And unfortunately, it manifests in our culture as self-loathing. I am not enough, you know. We all recognize this. This is a consequence of practicing attachment, the habit of it. Then on the overt level, as a result of that, if I'm not enough and don't have enough, the next level of attachment is evident. It's hankering after something. Well, what's missing? So you're looking out there for something. This is the grossest level. We look for the objects of the senses, the things to look at, smell, taste, touch. We are preoccupied with that. And attachment, craving is in the bones of our being, running that. Always looking for what we think it is, that such when I get it, it'll bring satisfaction. That's what we mean by what are the causes of happiness. As far as the world is concerned, the causes of happiness, to stop that dissatisfaction, is the things out there. So we spend our lives trying to manipulate the outside world to make it just so. But the Buddha's telling us there is this subtle level of suffering that we only really get into when we start to learn to meditate, which is the suffering of this attachment, that it's not actually, it's a misconception. It won't bring happiness. He's not being fundamentalist. He's not saying we're not allowed to have happiness and have cakes. No, he says we've got the attachment, this craving has got a deep, it's built into it as a misconception. And that by following it, we just increase it, you know. As my mother used to say, the more you get, the more you want. This is the key pain that Buddha is trying to identify, but it's hard for us to hear it because we think he's just being fundamentalist, not allowed to enjoy cake, and then we become, and that's the trouble with religion. When you become fundamentalist, you can't hear it properly. It's horrible, you know. And it's easy to make Buddhism to be fundamentalist about what Buddha means by attachment. It's really nuanced what he's saying, and it's extraordinarily powerful. But we've got to really go inside to look into it, you know. Yes, Helen.
Look, we are open to questions from everyone. So if you have a question, perhaps put the video on, put your hand up, or put something in the chat room. But I wanted to ask, you know, talking about meditation and talking about those neurotic states of mind you mentioned, to what extent is the path sort of clarifying the mind, working on the mind to perhaps get rid of those neurotic painful states of mind you were talking about?
That's the point. That's the essence. There's two, actually, there's a lovely saying, a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So the wisdom wing is this job. This is the nuts and bolts of the work we have to do on ourselves to turn ourselves forget achieving nirvana, forget the long-term result of ridding the mind utterly of this. That's nirvana. Forget that. Even the short term, if we work on our mind in this way, which is the internal work, which is the wisdom wing, wisdom is a good point, because when you're caught up in attachment and anger and misery and low self-esteem, we know we can't see past our own nose. We're miserable, and we're miserable to everybody else. So, and we can't see anything clearly. We just see our own projections. So as we practice using our meditation every day, as we practice being our own therapist, as Lama Yeshe puts it, then you really are doing the work. And the consequence of this is you become more powerful, more relaxed, more easygoing, more joyful. And therefore, you break down the barriers between self and other, and you get to become more empathetic and can then develop the compassion wing. You know, this is the major point. This is what practice is. And, you know, this is the essence of the practice. Knowing your own mind, working on it every second, instead of always dumping on the outside. And the world is painful. Bad things happen. But, you know, that's why I like to use my examples of women, my friends in prison, who live in these nightmarish environments, can't change a thing, but they know they can change their mind. They're very powerful examples. And this is the essence of what Buddha's telling us, really. It's extraordinary and very difficult, but when we can do it, we see the benefit. We are the beneficiaries of this practice, and then we can be of use to others. Then we can help the world, you know.
So how do you translate that to sort of a day-to-day practice, Robina? What do you recommend?
Well, I mean, if our topic here is nutrition, and I'm telling you, you know, let's say we're talking about nutrition, then you know the answer. You'd have to study nutrition. So here we're talking, and this is the thing that's a bit surprising to us. I think Buddhist view is a very specific view of the mind. It's so specific. It's not Jung, it's not Freud. We know the words attachment, anger, jealousy. It sounds easy, but we've got to have a sense of the way Buddha describes these states of mind and how they function so that I can identify them. It's not mystical, but we need a basic starting point, a basic program, a basic meditation practice, and there are many kinds we can do. We know that, but I think it's got to be combined with a little bit of knowledge about what Buddha says. You can't just, intuit how to make a cake. You got to learn the theories. You can't intuit how to know about nutrition. You have to learn the theory. So this is a powerful point, I think. Having a practice that helps you focus your mind so you can learn to see what the hell's going on in there, and then in the daily life, keep yourself steady so you know what's happening in here, not just dump it on the outside. But also it's helpful to imbue our practice with a little bit of knowledge of actually what Buddha says, which means read some decent sources on Buddha's teachings, because that's the stuff that we're going to also be using to help us in our practice. That makes sense, don't you think, Helen?
Yeah. This is actually a question from Sharon. I'm sure she won't mind if I ask it. Tibetan Buddhism is such an ancient, traditional, spiritual path. So how do you keep that relevant in today's world?
Well, it's not just Tibetan Buddhism, it's all of Buddhism, isn't it? Coming from 2,500 years ago, tracking itself back to the Indians before that. This is the point I'm saying, you have to learn it yourself. I mean, this is when I first heard these Tibetan, when Lama Zopa Rinpoche talking, Lama Zopa especially, because it was very traditional. I couldn't just, I didn't know what he was saying in the beginning. So I knew if there was something in here I wanted, and I became a nun and I studied, I had to learn it. I had to learn to think, to use the language he was using and learn the definitions of the words and learn to use it. So then as I slowly begin to understand it myself, then I can find other words to express it to people like me. See, that was the skill of Lama Yeshe. If anybody's read his books, he was, he somehow when he first met Western students in the mid-60s, they learned English, which was so kind of them. He somehow, because this is the thing about, I think, this path, when you really do develop wisdom, it's kind of a pretty powerful kind of wisdom you get. Because when you know your own mind and you can work with your mind, we're all just different variations of the same mind, really. And when you know your mind, you can see someone else's mind. So he had this ability to somehow understand the way we modern Western people thought. He had this extraordinary wisdom, and he learned how to communicate. It was like he learned how to talk in our language, which for me, every time I edit his books, it's just so moving and powerful, because it's an utterly different way of talking. But you've got to internalize it first, know what it means first, and then with our own words, find ways to express it. But it's got to be authentic, Do you understand, Helen?
Absolutely. But I guess going back to the 70s, when you became interested, so different from now. I mean, no one knew much about Buddhism. So
that's right, exactly.
So what can you sort of pinpoint something that made it so important that you gave up everything to ordain?
Well, I wouldn't put it like I gave up everything. I wouldn't say it like that. For me, my whole life, if I look back on it, I can see a logical progression. Although I began as a Catholic, loved God, in love with Our Lady, God, and all the saints and everything, really. And then 19 became a hippie, and then communist radical lefty, then black politics and feminist politics. It looked like I was jumping from here to there, but it was the logic of the internal was pretty consistent. I was looking for a way to understand the world. I was looking for a way explicitly for why there is suffering in the world, That was why I was politically active. So all the time moving in my own mind, moving, and then bumped into these two lamas. So I forgot your question now. What was your question? What was the end of your question? I forgot.
What was sort of the key?
What was it?
Yeah. What really resonated?
Yeah. I mean, I knew I wanted to understand the way to see the world. And up until then, I'd always been looking at the external. So I remember basically these lamas are basically saying, that's fine, Robina, learn about the external world. But honey child, you've got to learn about your own mind, the human mind, but the Buddha's view is everything comes from the mind. This might not be evident to us. And if you take the big picture point of view of Buddhism, which means continuity of consciousness, which means reincarnation, mind, everything comes from the mind over countless eons and moment by moment. Everything is in terms, our happiness and suffering is truly, from the Buddha's view, it's his logic, is based upon what's in our mind. So that's kind of a powerful concept. If we can really get that on board, that's the essence of what Buddha's saying. That's the essence of what he's saying. And that, for me, is pretty tasty. Because I can be in charge of my mind. Like I use the example always, the people who know me know this story of one woman on death row, Sunny, I know her now. She was accused of murdering 2 policemen, her husband as well. She was innocent, like going through hell in the cell in isolation. She said, finally, I realized I couldn't change anything, but they couldn't take my mind from me. So she kept her clarity and sanity, did her practice, did yoga every day, and she retained her sanity and clarity and came out of that prison 17 years later, not out of her mind like so many people, but a wiser, more compassionate person, because she worked on her mind. She wasn't a Buddhist, she wasn't religious. This is why it's such a powerful example. It's logical when we can see it and work with it, you know. We've got to really work hard though.
And just thank you for the work you did going into prisons. That's
okay,
remarkable.
Yeah.
Sky has a question. Sky, can you unmute?
Yes.
I always consider and wonder about the benefits of long-term retreats, and particularly, I know in the Tibetan tradition, you do the 3-year, etc. Just wondering the benefits of that, if you could discuss some of those, as opposed to most of us working and living in daily life.
I understand exactly, Sai.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Well, first of all, we have to understand the logical reasons for why you would do a retreat, you know, because I mean, from our point of view, from our philosophical materialist point of view, it's a mystical, bizarre idea. From a Western psychological point of view, it's totally insane. I mean, the Western psychological view tells us that we are social beings, and to be functional as a proper human being and to grow yourself as a human being, you must do it in the context of others. We've got to be social. Now, I'm not arguing, well, I am arguing, that's the view we have. So when you hear that that's how you become a decent human being, by being socialized and working in relation to others, that's how we discover who we are as far as our modern views are concerned. The Buddha doesn't deny that, but he says the fundamental point is the only way to the most direct way to really become who you are, which is finally an enlightened being, is to do it in isolation. So this is insane in the West. So we've got to know what that means, which means that you've got to get single-pointed concentration. This brilliant technique these Indians invented more than 3,000 years ago. There's no way in the universe we can realize the ultimate way of reality. There's no way we can finally unpack and unravel and rid the mind utterly of all the misconceptions, all the way to realizing selflessness and emptiness. There's not a possibility to realize emptiness unless you are in the single-pointed concentration of samadhi meditation. So you need that framework of total isolation. But to do it, you've got to be a highly developed person. I mean, a normal person to go into a retreat for a day, we'd lose our mind, because we don't know how to look at our mind. We have no understanding of the human mind. So without being rude to our neuroscientists and psychologists, the Buddhist view of the mind is so incredibly sophisticated, but we would never think of it like that. We just think of it as mystical. So to the long-term job, you've got to go but even in the short term, even just doing a weekend retreat, we can see the benefit of that. Forget about realizing emptiness. Just to remove yourself from the usual pressures of life can be very powerful. Why? To help you see what the hell is going on in your own mind so you can start to deal with it. We need space, you know, in an ordinary way, but the long term, we absolutely have to get single point of concentration, and that you can't do while you're washing the dishes, you know. Do you understand, Sky?
She's smiling.
Good. So look at the monks in the forest, you know, in Thailand. What else are they doing? They're looking into the nature of reality, you know. I mean, it's not possible to understand it from the Western point of view. It makes no sense. It's kind of like mental illness, you know. But when we understand the Buddha's view of the mind and what the potential is, then it makes sense. Yeah, it's very interesting. Most of us aren't qualified. I mean, very few of our people, you know, go into serious retreat, because most of us, we are the other group. We're doing it in the framework of our lives, you know. We've got to know where we're at and what's best for us. What else, Ben?
Asila, do you want to ask your question, or if you could unmute yourself? At the bottom. You'll see a little microphone down the bottom left of your screen.
All right. Okay. Well, I did type this, so I'll read out my typed message.
Yeah.
Hello, Sila, darling. I'm so happy to see you. She's my old friend.
Yes, nice to see you, Robina.
Yes.
I was late this morning because I was out at a Tisha Centre doing something that I needed to
How
do
wonderful.
at the shop. So
yeah, good. Well done, girl. I'm so happy you helped me out there.
Yeah.
Yes.
The
So
still is amazing. Sorry.
my question is, the survival instinct, which is so intrinsic to all beings, has been warped by humans, as we already have pretty much what we need to survive. And so this instinct has gotten out of control. Isn't all craving and attachment based on our survival instinct?
No, I think, Sarah, that's a really good way of putting it. So if I just, use Buddha's language to answer it, you'll see what I'm saying. Basically, I would say this survival instinct that we articulated like that really is what the Buddha would refer to as the deepest, most primordial neurotic state of mind, the delusion called ego grasping. So in other words, when bad things happen, our first instinct is to panic and protect ourselves. Now, I mean, this sounds shocking to say that that's a delusion, because it's also common sense. But, that the Buddha would say, and so, of course, with the way we frame instinct for survival, that we need it in order to be at the time of when a problem comes, when you're about to have a crash or you get attacked, we need it to kind of keep us on the alert. Well, the Buddha's view is, let me tell a story, basically. This is Lama Zopa. He was recognized in a past life, you must know this, as a reincarnated one of these yogis, right? So he got recognized as a little boy. He's 8 years old, up in the mountains, he's a Sherpa. And so when he was about 8 or 9, after he'd been recognized as this reincarnated yogi, he was up a mountain, up in another monastery. And he would have been about 1952, okay? And he'd never met, anyway, whatever. And there was in a monastery, and across the big, what the rivers are like up there, massive, very powerful river. Across the other side of the river, there were these weird-looking people, as he said, they had pale eyes, straw-coloured hair. I mean, white people, basically. He hadn't met white people before. Now, most of his students are white people now. Not all, but most. So he had this wish to meet them. So he went across these rickety bridge, they're very dangerous, with this bowl of potatoes. Sherpas eat their potatoes as a gift, but he fell in the river. And this is how he told the story. It's very powerful. He fell in the river, and these rivers are tumultuous, I tell you. And of course, they don't teach them swimming up there, So anyway, this is how he told the story. He said, the head. This is when they study emptiness a lot, and they meditate and learn. They talk about very objective. They sort of the head, the anger, the jealousy, not my head, my anger, I. The head came to the surface, and he said, I could see my manager, the panicking, running along the bank, because he's having a panic attack about Lama Zopa falling into the water. The head came to the surface for air. He was trying to breathe. And then he said, eventually the thought occurred to me. The person known as the Laudo Lama, that was him, is about to die. The person known as the Laudo Lama, not I'm about to die. The person known as the Laudo Lama is about to die. But then he said, I didn't know anything about emptiness. So in that life, he hadn't studied anything, but there was no fear. So meaning, this is shocking, he didn't have any what we call panic and instinct for survival. Because when you realized emptiness, when you've cut the root of all fear, you literally don't have fear. But it doesn't mean he didn't have common sense. He could see exactly what was happening. And in fact, he could probably see it better because he wasn't panicking. And you need intelligence to make a decision about what to do in a dire situation, not fear. So you could argue that if he had drowned, he would not have had a freak out. He wouldn't have panicked. But because he didn't have fear doesn't mean he just sank to the bottom of a river. Oh, well, I'm going to drown. That's chucking the baby out of the bathwater. He still had intelligence and common sense, and eventually he got himself saved. So for the fear one, for the Buddha, the instinct for survival is an exaggeration. And so because we see it in every being, and we all have it, well, it's because we've all got ego grasping. But when you've given up ego grasping, you give up fear, you give up delusions, and you become a happy person. And wise and intelligent and know what to do in a dire situation. That's my comment. What do you think, Silla? Does it make sense?
You will have to unmute again, Silla.
In place, right? Yes. It makes sense. I still think that our survival. We have a survival instinct for a reason.
No. I'm just giving Silla. That's fine, you can say that, but I'm talking from the Buddhist perspective, and he doesn't say it that way. So all I can do is give you the Buddhist view. You can have your view and say it like that, but I'm giving you the Buddhist take on that. This instinct survival is ego grasping, is this, and it gives rise, as Helen said, to this craving, the deepest craving to me and to life. So the Buddha is saying we can give it up, but that doesn't chuck the baby out of the bathwater. You end up with clarity and bliss and love and compassion and intelligence, and that's what we need. That's what my comment on that. You don't have to accept what I'm saying, but that's the Buddhist analysis of instinct for survival.
Right, but the Buddha,
you're assuming,
the Buddha would not deny that we need, in fact, the Buddha was very careful to create shelter and a way to feed.
That doesn't come from instinct for survival. That comes from common sense and being kind to people. That comes from a virtue, not a non-virtue. That comes from intelligence.
Yeah,
that's not
I guess what I'm saying is, the instinct for survival is not a negative thing to have.
Buddha's call it, so it's another label. Buddha calls it ego grasping because it brings fear, it brings panic, it brings other and me and wars. But love and kindness and compassion comes from intelligence, and that doesn't bring other, and that doesn't bring wars. I would put it that way. But I hear you. Right. All I can do is give you my Buddhist analysis of it. That's all I can say.
Yes.
Good, darling.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you, sweetheart. Who else is there, Helen? Any more questions?
I think, does Lozanne want to ask a question?
Oh, I have another question.
Oh, good, Zilla. Helen. Good, darling. Go.
Okay. Some teachers would say that you can have single-pointed concentration when you're washing the dishes, or when you're walking, or when you are having a conversation with someone.
I understand.
That you don't have to go off onto a retreat to develop one-pointed concentration and meditation. That you can, that everything in your life can be some form, a form of mindful meditation.
Absolutely. The last statement, I agree. But I think if we look at the technique and look at the different levels of concentration, as taught even by the Hindus, by definition, single-pointed concentration, samadhi, by definition, you have gone beyond the conceptual and the sensory, and you would look like you were dead. So no, you could not do that while you were doing the dishes. It's a function of a subtler level of cognition. But concentration in general, of course, no argument there. The benefit of doing a meditation is that you can focus on what you're doing every day. That's the point. But single-pointed concentration is a very specific state that's necessarily far more subtle and is beyond conceptual and beyond sensory. That's the point I was making. So once you get that, then you can do your dishes great. You understand?
It sounds something to it. Something fantastic.
That's it, right. That's exactly right, yes. So who else is there, Helen? Anybody else?
I can't see anyone else with their hand up at the moment.
Okay.
But given that we're representing Sakyadhita, Robina, I wanted to ask you, looking at it from a gender point of view, firstly, how I really admire the Tibetan nuns, because I believe they have to sort of support themselves as well as get into their practice. So, as I understand it, they don't get much organisational support. So just how difficult is it being a nun?
I think more and more these days it's really good for nuns, and that I think directly has come from the influence of Western women. Definitely. I mean, here at Kopan, back in 79, that's why Lama Yeshe was so amazing. In 79, he started the growth of our Gakel nunnery. Now there are 500 nuns down there. Many do long retreat. Many of them are already graduated as Geshis. They've done all the philosophical study. They've graduated as Geshis. And I think there are so many communities of Tibetan nuns all over in India and Nepal now that have now, and it's the direct result of the influence of Western women, for sure. I mean, so it's much better now. It's fantastic, actually.
And so the whole issue of gender equity, given that it's coming from this 14th century sort of medieval background you talked about, but
that's right. Exactly.
Gender equity is in Tibetan Buddhism is moving with sort of modern time.
Oh, I'd definitely say, no, no question about it. I'd definitely say that, yes. I would say that. That's my experience, certainly being around this organisation. Some other organisations perhaps not. I mean, if you hear Tenzin Palmo talk, that was not her experience. She came from a very different environment. Her teacher was Tibetan, like mine, but they didn't speak English, and she was around Tibetans and around Tibetan monks. So it was quite painful. Quite difficult. I've never found it like that here. It's always found, certainly in our organization, and I'm talking from being a radical feminist. I was a really serious radical feminist. I would say with Lama Zopa Lama Yeshe, they give jobs to you if you had the qualities, and so many of their top people are female. I mean, yeah, I'd say so. Within the modern world, definitely, I'd say it's a lot better, and among Tibetans for sure now. I would say that. I would suggest that. Yeah, not so perfect. I mean, I think sexism and misogynism is very deep in our mind. And this is what I found, just as an interesting point, that I remember when I first heard the teachings, when I heard about karma, I realized, well, Robina, who created you? You created yourself. You can't blame anybody else. So I think sexism and these views are very deep in our mind. And if we take reincarnation as our view, we've all been men before. We've all been women before. So it's just the way that our dualistic mind manifests, that we always divide ourselves into groups, and have, the top groups and the low groups. I mean, it's a dangerous thing. So we've got to watch our mouths like hawks. But it's a very deep thing in the mind, I'd say, among all of us.
I think Beth, who's in Cambodia, has a question.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Actually, a comment, because I've been here a long time. And when I got here, we don't have bhikkhunis.
No, right, exactly.
There's been this whole movement in the Theravada to reestablish that. It is finally almost reaching Cambodia.
Yes,
but
the same in Tibet. There's very few bhikkhunis here in Tibet as well, and that's very much still pretty entrenched among the Tibetans, among the monks. It's not established yet as well, but people go and get it in other countries. Go on, Beth. Yeah.
Well, here they go to Sri Lanka to study and be ordained, and there may be 5 of them in the country. But the point is, when I started, the Yeshes, that's the practical equivalent of a nun, were not even fed in the monasteries.
No,
they had to house themselves in the monastery, feed themselves, feed the monks. Now, at least a few of the major monasteries are feeding the nuns.
That's good, isn't it? I know it takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's been very deep in Asia. I mean, in Asia, not just since the 14th century. I mean, we know that's a huge thing in Asia, isn't it?
Yeah.
In Asian life for centuries.
Yeah. But the point is, there is actually progress. There is actually movement.
Exactly. That's
and
right.
We're not, I mean, Thailand got fairly polarized around this. And in Cambodia, it's happening very quietly. So the polarization is not.
I understand. Yes, I understand. Yes. That's good to know. Thank you.
And here it's not, in fact, the Western nuns. It's Sri Lanka that has been the driving force for bhikkhuni ordination in the Theravada tradition. Now, my own ordination is in Japanese Zen, so I see this as a sort of outsider-insider. But it is heartening. It's also, I think we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which lay people, especially lay women, have got very, very deep commitments to the Dharma that get expressed through devotion. And I think that the thrust toward making bhikkhunis has often not recognized this. But
Beth, can I just butt in? Robina, I'm really sorry, I accidentally muted you.
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I see, okay. Thank you. I'm fine.
Yeah. Anyway,
thank you, so good to hear. Good to hear, darling. It's good to know what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful to hear you. It's absolutely wonderful to hear you.
Good, Beth. Happy to talk. Happy. What else is there, Helen? Anybody else got something to say?
Anyone else got a question? Well, while they're thinking of some, just how important, Robina, do you see a community of nuns developing, because
well, I think, yeah.
I see
Well, I think,
nuns in
no.
Australia being a little bit isolated, some, going out on their own. The individual versus community.
Well, first of all, it seems to be, isn't it? If we look at the Buddha's teachings and the Buddha way he set things up, the communities of monks and communities of nuns was a fundamental thing, and I can see the benefit. But of course, we Westerners are very independent. We like to do our own trip. We're not very good at being good girls and good boys in groups. But in our organization, we've got a group of monks in France, about 40 or 50, I think, and that seems to work pretty well. We've got a group of nuns not very far away. There's a few nuns there and it's growing. We've got a group of nuns up at Chenrezig Institute. We've got a group of nuns in Spain, in Italy, in other places. And so they're always fairly small. And over the years, I'd say in our organization, maybe 600 people have ordained as monks and nuns. And now we have maybe 400 left. So it's probably 60%. 30% have gone, which is natural. There's disrobing among all of them. So I think it's kind of more and more support gradually, and we've got an organization that is trying to raise money to support monks and nuns, to be able to support them all financially. So, but it's slow. I don't know that much deep, but it's individuals. I live on my own in an apartment in New York, and I do not want to live in a nunnery. Not because I don't like nuns. I'm a nun, but it's the way my life is. I travel a lot. I'm editing, and it just makes sense. And many people are like that, and I think it's our right. We can each decide what's the best way for our life. Some people live in Dharma centers with lay people. So it's really important we find what we need. And many people really want the community. So it's up to each person to know what's right and to try, and of course, provide the conditions for it, Here, the nunnery works really well. 500 nuns there, 500 monks up here, all doing their own study, and they're all supported. They get really good support.
Because nuns, they must get support. They must, have enough for basic living. So
yes, that's right. Difficult. I think it's happening more and more, but it's been quite entrenched. It's quite, so we just keep moving, isn't it?
Okay, well, look, I'd like to sort of change subject unless there's any other questions. I'm intrigued by what's happening in Kathmandu with Lama Zopa. Now there was some.
Okay, well, that's what's interesting, isn't it? The emphasis in Buddhism, especially among the Tibetans, because they've got this institution where they formally recognize reincarnations. So, of course, if you're Buddhist, and in any country, then we just take reincarnation as a given. But for some reason in Tibet, it's been this institutionalized of looking, and in a way there's something very positive about it, I would say. So one of the main things, Lama Zopa was quite well known. He's got all these different people. He was quite well known in the Tibetan Buddhist world and very respected by the Dalai Lama and other people for all the work he does. He's got hundreds of projects working with animals and poor people and old people and sick people. He's got, besides his centers, there's so many projects. So he's quite well known and respected. So what's happening here is people have been coming to Kopan, the last 2 weeks now, since Lama Zopa stopped breathing. So, okay, first of all, talk about him and the way he was up in the mountains and he stopped breathing and he came here and he's in meditation. They call it, he was in meditation. And this is the point of the Silla. There's Lama Zopa looking like he's dead, but he's at his subtle mind, and he's been a meditator all his life. So he's totally conscious at a subtle level. And then since it started, the monks and the nuns have been doing prayers and practices 24 hours a day, and all the Western people are coming to visit, and we've been doing things all day, every day. So the focus, and this is the interesting point, it's not on helping Lama Zopa. Theoretically, he was a highly evolved being. He doesn't need help. We as the students need help. And so the main emphasis on these practices is for the, as they call it, the swift return of the reincarnation. So the Dalai Lama has written a prayer, 2 other lamas have written prayers, and all the emphasis and all our own approach here is wanting Lama Zopa to return to continue to teach. That's the very specific approach here, which is kind of interesting. So it's not to do with much grief and sadness. It's more positive, looking forward to the next one, So I don't know what people think of that, but that's very much the approach here.
When you said he's written a prayer, does that give some hint about possible reincarnation?
No, it's just kind of expressing Lama Zopa's qualities, and may he please return as quickly as possible for his disciples, something like that. One of the Lama Zopa's main disciples, this female Lama, we all just call them Kadrila in Tibetan, but I can't think of her name even. But she's very devout. She's an extraordinarily highly evolved being. Lama Zopa said she was born, she came into this life fully developed as Vajrayogini. She's an extraordinary woman, does her own practice. She's really amazing, very close to Dalai Lama, and she's really close to Lama Zopa. She's written a prayer as well. She was here organizing some of the things that they were doing. She's quite expert, but she's an amazing woman. So that's incidental. It's encouraging to have these highly realized female teachers around as well, but she's very devoted to Lama Zopa. And interestingly, he's also devoted to her. Back when I was here in 2019 leading the Copan course, and Lama Zopa was here, and she was here too, and Rinpoche laughed and said, I've now got a lady Lama, he said. He's got about 30 Lamas. He's now got my first lady Lama, but she's his Lama and he's her Lama, so it's mutual. It's very nice to see.
So speaking about that, Robina, will there be other teachers coming along to take the place of Lama Zopa and Lama Rinpoche?
Well, I know that in our organization, because the way it started was Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe. They started the centers. I came along, there were about 10 centers at the time, and then they were always called the spiritual directors. And when Lama Yeshe passed away in 84, Lama Zopa has been called our spiritual director. But he said very clearly when we gave, he left, he talked to our board of directors about whatever, and talked, to Venerable Roger, who's been his attendant all these years, and also the CEO of our organization. Very clearly, he doesn't necessarily want one to hand over to one person. So they've been in touch with the Dalai Lama. He's very close to Lama Zopa, and they're consulting him. And I think there's no particular plan right now what will happen. The centers will just keep going, the projects will keep going, but there's no one person, I think, who will take over that job. That's what
how long are these ceremonies in Kathmandu continuing?
For the 49 days. The tradition is for the 49 days when you're in this, typical people are in the intermediate state of the bardo. But of course, highly evolved beings who choose how to die, they're not in the bardo. They're just, he's already, wherever, maybe he's already reborn, But this is a tradition that they do it for the 49 days.
Jenna has a question. Jenna, do you want to ask it, or will I read it? You can unmute yourself. Bottom.
I'm happy if you'd like to ask it.
Hello, Jenna. Talk to me, sweetheart.
Talk to me, Jenna.
Venerable, lovely to meet you, Tashi Dilek from Melbourne. I was just wondering if you could explain the process about how to become a nun and how ordaining actually works. I'm just curious about how you did that.
Yeah. Well, it depends very much. I mean, Beth has her own style. Beth in Cambodia must have a particular approach. And in the Tibetan one, typically, so what had happened, typically, like in Tibet, right here now in Kathmandu, and this is still the way it is among both the monks and the nuns. This is how it is for the Tibetans and all the Himalayan people. They send their children to the school. Basically, it's how they get their education. But the child, typically they would send one of their children, whether the kid wanted it or not. But these days, the kids tend to say they'd like it. So this monastery here, there's little boys here, 6 and 7. Down in the nunnery, it's the same. There's little girls. So they join when they're young. Some of them, others choose it as they get older. So they'd say to their mother, they really want to become a nun. And so they go to the nunnery and then they join. They literally live there and they start learning to live like a nun. You take your first set of vows, you get your set of robes, you'd live in the community, you'd come to the prayers every day and you'd learn. It becomes integrated. So because in the West there are less monasteries and nunneries, these days in our organization, there are places to go. So, I know that if you get ordained. So what happened is, in my case, back in 77, when I wanted to become a nun, I met the lamas in Australia, knew I wanted to become a nun. And that's when I talk about giving up. I didn't go there. But I mean, for my own life, I was into sex and drugs and jazz, never rock and roll. So somehow all that kind of fell, I'm talking about personally, it fell away. I didn't kind of all of a sudden overnight give it all up. I decided very clearly I didn't want to get married and have babies. I always felt that. I gave up cigarettes at some point. I gave up marijuana at some point. I gave up alcohol at some point. It kind of just fell away. And by the time I met these lamas, it was a natural next step. A next logical step. Since a little girl, I went to mass when I was a little girl, and I knew it was my job to be a priest. I announced it. Of course, they all laughed. I wasn't a boy, but I'd always had that strong aspect. So for me, it was a very logical process. And by the time I was 31, 32, met these lamas, I recognized my path. I came here to Copan. I asked Lama Yeshe, and then I got ordained. And then I didn't live in a nunnery. I went to England and worked in one of our big centers and worked for Wisdom Publications, editing for 10 years. So we had a monastic environment. So that was, but also lay people. Other people will go to go to one of the communities, but typically you have this aspiration, you'd want it, you'd then you know, you'd talk to somebody maybe who is a monk or a nun, you'd go to one of those places, you'd then, I mean, in India, for example, at our center, Dalai Lama every year gives ordination, and people go all over the world to get ordained from him, but they'd often do a course first, a pre-ordination course at one of our centers in Dharamsala, and then you'd go and get ordained. But he would often ask for Westerners that you commit to living in a community to 4 to 5 years, don't just wander off into the world, because, you know, you'll give it up in a month if you do that. So there's different approaches. Some places, I know in Taiwan, it's more strict. You do a lot more study and preparation and the stages. You know, it's a bit more ad hoc in the Tibetan one. Does that make sense?
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. I've just taken the Bodhisattva vow as well. So
well done, girl. Well done.
Thank
well done,
you.
Jenna. Thank you, darling.
So Mary has
Scylla has another question. Yes, Scylla. Talk to me, sweetheart.
Actually, I think it's Mary saying, Scylla, you're muted.
Unmute, Scylla. There we go.
Yes, Mary has the question. Does she?
Oh, I see. I see.
One thing I was going to say in the Plum Village tradition, to become a monastic, monk or nun, first you have to be under 50. It used to be under 40, but now it's under 50. Because I think some people like to become nun, you know, in the Asian tradition when they're older. It's almost like an old folks' home. You go and become a nun. So they have an age limit. And then you have to live in the community, I think, for a year. And that means being actually at Plum Village, France, or one of the, or a designated monastery, not even all the monasteries, for a year. And then the next step is that you have to be accepted by the Sangha. They have to actually say, yes, you'll be able to do this work. You know, that's
very democratic.
And then after that, you have to spend at least 4 or 5 years at a monastery, living in a monastery in community. So there's actually quite delineated steps. Yeah. Anyway,
thank you, Stella. That's very nice. Thank you so much.
And
so
on top of that,
Mary
is asking, are there any age or any other restrictions?
I don't know about the age one. I don't know about that. There might well be, but I just don't know about it.
Or any other restrictions when it.
I don't know. I mean, there must. I think you've got to be sort of fairly healthy, otherwise, just I mean, I don't know. I don't know enough about all that. I'm sorry. Yeah. I think there is some discussion, of course, about whether if you're transgender, what community you live in, and usually I think they still base it on the organs you were born with. That's what I've heard. There's lots of discussion of that. That's what I've heard.
That's a whole different area.
Yeah, that's right. Another discussion.
Moving on to Linda. Linda's got a question.
Yes.
What do you ask it, Linda? Or
yes.
Or do you want me to read it? You're muted, Linda. I think she wants me to read it. So,
okay, good. Go.
When talking about the Western view, it seems that there's an assumption that traditional Eastern population embrace meditation with retreats and focused Dharma practice. But I don't actually see that in reality. It's a view that seems to be taken on by Westerners.
I missed the point in the beginning of what Linda was saying. I'm so sorry, Helen. Could you please say it again?
Okay.
I missed the point.
Sorry, it's just a little bit. Here we go.
Yeah.
When talking about the Western view, it seems that there's an assumption that traditional Eastern population embrace meditation with retreats and focused Dharma practice. But I don't actually see that in reality. It's a view that seems to be taken on by Western practitioners as they embrace Buddhist practice embedded in a foreign culture and tradition. Perhaps it's a view that arose as part of renouncing their Western upbringing in order to embrace a foreign and somewhat exotic culture.
The trouble is I didn't hear the first sentence properly, so I heard all the rest of it, but I can't understand what Linda is saying, this difference that perhaps is coming.
Well, she's saying when talking about the Western point, they seem to take on this Eastern tradition, perhaps more so than they do in the East. Is that right, Linda?
I don't understand the point. I'm really sorry, Linda. I really want to understand.
Yeah, hi, Robina. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
I can, darling.
Yeah. Because in the beginning, you were saying about the Western, I guess you're talking more about Western psychology, but, there's this view that sort of the Western way of thinking is one way and the Eastern way is another. But in my experience, after many years...
So hang on, just to get clear. So what you're saying is you're suggesting that we're talking about Westerns have a particular psychological approach and Easterns have another psychological approach. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's what I'm hearing. That's what
that's right. Oh, I see. No, I get your point. Now I get your point.
A lot of teachers, what I find is that teachers who are Western raised and then sort of take on robes in another tradition tend to have that view. And I just don't see that that's relevant anymore.
I see.
And, and I think I think that I would like to see more sort of focus on the reality of the here and now. We have an acknowledging the strength and the commitment of practice and the study of the Dharma in Western lay practitioners.
Yes.
And I think there's a time and a real need now for us to discuss other models for growing, centres or ways of practice to support the Dharma in the West.
Yes.
I honestly can't see that the younger generation are going to be so enamoured by Tibetan culture, Thai culture, Sri Lanka.
Yes, that's right. No, that's right, darling. Absolutely.
Yeah,
that's exactly.
Yeah. So we have to start kind of looking, what is now, and what are the needs for the future? I also don't think that we can sustain the Thai forest tradition.
You don't think, huh?
Well, basically, for financial reasons, you can't go and build a simple hut in the bush anymore.
That's right.
So we need new ideas. We need to be thinking, how can we support practitioners who want to go forward, who want to make a really strong commitment. But the models that we've sort of that are in place right now are from a different time,
I see.
Imported from other cultures.
I understand. So, Linda, this is the thing I really agree with, but I feel it's got to be done organically and slowly, and it is you and I and the rest of us have to do it. We have to be the ones who do it. First, we have to practice. We have to be sincere. We have to take the fully developed, marvelous traditions that we have got from these holy beings, and then we are the ones who carry it in our minds into our world. So it's our responsibility, Linda. We're doing it. And I think we have to be patient in the process. If we are authentic and practice properly, it will happen. It can't be forced, just can it? We have to, so it's our response. That's what I felt. It's our responsibility as modern Western people who've got this karmic connection with these traditions to do exactly what you're saying. And my sense is it maybe is happening slowly. I'm not sure, Linda. What do you think?
I guess, perhaps for another session, it'd be good to hear from teachers such as yourself. You're seeing these schools, but what are the younger people saying? Is this, what do you see as being perhaps other alternative kind of ways of setting up centres and practice and integrating the strength of the monastic teachings to be more accessible, I guess,
I understand.
Without the division, the cultural divisions and things.
Yeah, sure. That's a major point, Linda. It's a really good point, darling. So meanwhile, we keep moving and showing example, don't we?
Sure.
Thank you so much, darling. Thank you so much.
Robina, you've observed that. You've observed that growth over decades. So your outlook is positive for the growth of Buddhism?
I think there's no choice but to be. Have to be positive and have to be sincere and authentic and just keep moving, and have this courage to keep moving, and it'll take its form the way it. We've got to be conscious about it, very strategic. Linda suggesting that, but meanwhile, just keep moving, just each one of us, and it can't. And the danger is, I think, it's a danger. I know when I was talking on a radio program with some Christian people, and all they talked about was the externals and the structures. And so I think if you go so much into that, and Linda's not saying that, you can lose the internal. I think it's got to come from the internal. It's got to come from internal authentic practice. Then it will continue. Then it will grow from the inside out. We can't impose it from the outside in. I think that can be a big danger, you know. So I'm confident. I'm optimistic. Yes,
Silla, I think this might be our last question.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
I
Yeah.
think the continuation of Buddhism is a big question in the West.
is it going to be a question or is it a statement? Because I think we've got no time for more discussion on this topic. I don't want to discuss it further.
A lot of institutions have brought in a kind of Sunday school or bringing the kids with you, and I think if we don't do that, then the next generation doesn't really get that input like we got as children. You know, I went to Sunday school and church, and I think that's why I developed my spiritual capacity. So don't we have to?
That's part of it. Of course it is, Silly. You're absolutely right. It's logical, isn't it? It makes complete sense what you're saying. Absolutely. I agree with you, darling. Someone else, I think Beth had something to say. What do you have, Beth?
Just quickly, I don't think we should underestimate what's actually happening in the traditional Buddhist countries. That this question of modernizing, transforming, how we do this, how people do this, that there is also, sure, there's secularization, there's globalization, there's all that stuff, but there's also the reinterpretation, transformation from within in the cultures that have been Buddhist for thousands of years. And I think it's important not to disrespect that.
No, I understand you. That makes sense, Beth. So people, I think, Helen, I think we're done for the day. What do you think?
Thank you, Robina.
Okay.
Thank you. Just hold on a sec. We really appreciate your time. I know it's very early in the morning there, so it's time for you to go and have a nice strong coffee.